And we want to welcome Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley, Republican candidate for governor. Thanks so much for taking part in our gubernatorial candidate interviews. I'm Christy McDonald from Detroit Public Television. In the room today and doing the questioning are members of the Detroit Journalism Cooperative. The DJC is made up of 6 media outlets: Detroit Public Television, Bridge Magazine, Michigan Radio, WDET Radio, New Michigan Media, and Chalkbeat Detroit. And we would like to thank the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for its support on today's project. All right, our panel includes, starting on my left, Erin Einhorn. She is the bureau chief of Chalkbeat Detroit. Riley Beggin, she is the politics reporter for Bridge Magazine. Steve Carmody, he's the reporter-producer at Michigan Radio. Hassan Khalifa, he's a reporter with the Arab American News and New Michigan Media. And Sandra Svoboda from WDET Radio. For the next hour, each journalist will ask a series of questions and follow up on your answers if they need more specifics. And we appreciate you keeping your answers concise so we can get to as many topics as possible. I will give us a 30-minute time reminder so we can keep ourselves on track and so we can take this next hour. All right, we're going to start off with some questions, I think, really on leadership and responsibility. Much has been made of the management style of previous governors, a de facto head of the party with strong-arm tactics of getting things done, to our current governor, who has been criticized at times for not being as politically savvy as he needed to be. First off, explain what your management leadership style is.
Well, I'm a people person. I like to bring people together. Today it seems like the political culture, just cycle after cycle, since going back to the 90s, has just gotten more focused on fighting. And I get it. People get passionate about fighting for what you believe in, but ultimately the secret to our successes, the secret to moving things forward, is about bringing people together, staying at the table, working things out, trying to understand another person's point of view and where they're coming from, and even coming to a common understanding when you can't come to a common conclusion. That oftentimes can show you a pathway forward to relate or maintain the relationship, even if you're going to be at odds on any particular issue. I just think that's important in our system today. And it doesn't mean you don't fight hard for what you believe in, but it's not about the fight. It's about the outcome, about the results, about getting things done and making things happen.
Can you get things done? People would say, gosh, it's such a polarized atmosphere in Lansing, in Washington. Do you believe that you can get things done with a compromise on both sides attitude?
Well, there is first of all, we already have an extraordinary track record of making things happen, and very different looking coalitions have come together to make the big things happen. So whether it was 2 major rounds of tax reform that looked very, very different, both equally impactful on Michigan, both scrapping the old business tax and doing something brand new, and phasing out the industrial personal property tax. Totally different looking coalitions came together to make both of those things happen. When it was autism insurance reform on the table, that was a whole, all the giants of the political system opposed us on that, and we had to overcome it with what I affectionately refer to as poems, pissed off autism moms. This army of people that were like, no, this system, business groups and unions and insurance companies might all be against this, but we're just going to unite together and make this happen. And they did. It was one of the most beautiful, amazing things I've ever seen. But the thing is, on any particular different issue, there's a different coalition that comes together to make it happen. And that's why I still look at this all very much as a relationship process. And maintaining those relationships, even when you're totally at odds on an issue, being respectful of another person, understanding their point of view, can often show you a way to getting things done, or even if you can't, at least you maintain the type of working relationship you need to work together on the next issue.
Do you see the governor's role as the head of the Republican Party and tasked to carry out what the Republican Party's agenda is in the state?
As a practical matter, the governor is a kind of a de facto leader of the party. But that's not I don't view that as a top-down hammer type of an approach. There's a grassroots organization out there that are involved in all kinds of great things, and the Republican Party is a very, very different looking group from one side of our state to the other, in different types of priorities and different outlooks and approaches. But ultimately, it is I do believe it is the one of the responsibilities of the governor to really be a unifier. That's we have a system where they have two major parties, and having the governor being very actively engaged and involved in the overall management of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party from administration to administration is a traditional and appropriate role.
All right, let's go ahead and take on, I think, one of the biggest issues that people are talking about in the state of Michigan is education. And so I'm going to go over to Erin for our first questions on education.
Right.
Yeah, we heard from several people in our audience who had questions about education. Judith specifically wanted to know what your plans are for schools. So do you believe that schools in Michigan have the resources they need to succeed to serve all students, including those with special needs? And do you think that our schools right now are funded equitably?
Well, the issues that face our schools are way, way bigger than funding. Of course, you could always do with additional resources, and economic growth has created an environment of growth and resources for schools, as has paying down long-term debt and liabilities. I mean, we have reformed the system in a lot of ways to where we're creating a much, much better future for the dollars actually reaching the classroom. There's decades, literally, my entire lifetime of neglect of the long-term liabilities just ate into what was supposed to be for the classroom. And so a lot of the groundwork has been laid, and the foundation has been laid for the resources, the classroom-based resources, to get the majority of the economic growth of the future. But there are some areas where I think there's a lot of work to do, specialty services in particular. Some students have particular or intensive challenges and needs. I formed the Special Education Task Force because I was concerned that there's all this debate on education overall, and it seemed like Republicans, Democrats, nobody was talking about special education, the kids that really have the largest obstacles in front of independence for themselves and self-determination of their lives in front of them. And it's a big number. I asked the group to estimate what the difference is between what is needed and what is provided today, and it's about $700 million around the state. Now, when you consider that the school aid fund is now upwards of around $14 billion, keep in mind we're talking in massively large numbers here, but still $700 million is a lot. They came up, the task force that I led came up with several recommendations, and many of those either have been or are in the process of being implemented. But ultimately, the funding formula itself for special education needs to change. The difference between the highest funded special education district and the lowest funded education district, keeping in mind that they're still property tax based in a big way, unlike the rest of education, is about tenfold. Right? There's a 10 times difference between the highest and the lowest. And so some kids get a lot of services and other kids don't get much at all, depending on where they live. And that's something that has to be rectified. That's why I put together the task force report, and I have fully, there's heavy lifts in that, and I have fully adopted it as my platform, because we can't afford to leave anybody behind.
So you talked about some inequitable distribution of funds as far as special education, but the basic funding structure we have for schools, the $700-800 roughly per child that the state sends to each school, whether that be a district school or a charter school, is that basic system, is it an equitable way of funding schools?
Well, that's the base foundation allowance, and there are a lot of additional categorical funding streams for kids that have more intensive needs or at-risk kids and other programs. But there has been ever since Proposal A, which closed the majority of the gap between schools, there has been still a gap in there for these out-of-formula districts. What we have been doing throughout the entire administration is increasing the lower-funded schools twice as much as the higher-funded schools, and we've closed that gap about 50%. I believe about half of that gap has been closed now. And keeping on that same formula is important for the future, because when you put the different schools on an equal playing field, I think it's the first step. But we've been talking about money, right? Everybody always wants to talk about money, but if you look at the states that have done really well, and I like to look at Tennessee, because Tennessee went from way behind to just performance much better than most of the rest of the nation. And if you look at what they did, one of the components that is very different than what happens here is the way that they support their teachers. Now I say support the teachers, everybody thinks money, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. That's not what they did. This, and I'm sure that they do support their teachers financially, but the big difference was professional development, teacher coaching, teacher training, helping good teachers become great teachers and great teachers become even greater teachers, to equip teachers with the latest and greatest in research and best practices and getting it into the classroom quicker. That whole system for making that work is very intentional and robust. And that's something that I'm really excited about, the difference that it could make here in the school, and a new mission for the Department of Education, which today is just it's mainly a compliance organization. And I think it would be much better serve schools if it was a collection of best practice and trainers and professional developers, and a cadre of trainers in all different specialty areas that can spread across our state and be that type of support network.
So if I could ask you a little bit about how we measure success in schools. The state's current, given that test scores are often driven by socioeconomic and other factors, do you think the state's current accountability system is giving parents a fair and accurate measure of how our schools are doing?
I think that we have an overemphasis on the testing today as compared to what is needed. Now, that's not to say you're not going to have testing. Of course you're going to have testing. You're going to have some standardized testing. But kids aren't standard. At the end of the day, we're preparing kids for life. And there are a lot of different pathways to being successful in life. And when you try to derive everything according to a standardized testing process, you're treating kids who are not standard as though they are standard. And so kids bring different types of challenges with them to school. And that has to be taken into consideration, not just for how we measure whether a school is being successful, but also the types of interventions that we provide. So it's this idea of making sure that the intervention fits the kid instead of the kid having to fit the intervention that happens to be available. When we talk about reading, it's frustrating where all I hear people talk about is reading coaches. Reading coaches are good for some kids, but the majority of kids that are struggling with reading, that's not all they need. And so that's a component, but it's like oversimplifying a very pervasive problem. And it could be a child that has dyslexia. It needs a particular type of an approach, a very specialized approach. It could be that the child has a vocabulary issue. If you're reading, the child might be able to read, but if they don't know the words that they're reading, they're not going to test high in comprehension. So in that case, you need vocabulary work. In other cases, they might need help with phonics. But if we're providing a one-size-fits-all intervention and never really getting to the root of what is causing the problem for this child being behind in the first place, the intervention won't work.
So I realize you're talking about intervention of specific students, but when it comes to state policy, obviously the state's dealing at a much sort of broader level. And when we talk about state intervention in education, one of the things we often talk about is school closings and using test scores to decide which schools should be open and which schools shouldn't. What role do you think the state should be playing? Should the state be playing a role in deciding whether or not schools should close, or should the state be?
There's absolutely an accountability role that the state needs to play, but I look at it as a very long-term partnership process. And you might get to a point at the end of the day when it's just you've been through all the different possibilities, you just can't make the types of changes that need to be made. But it should be earlier intervention and prevention of school closing, as opposed to instead of having a school closing process, why not have a school improvement process that serves as a prevention of the need to close schools in the first place. And that is I'll always resort back to the individual student approach. But collectively, that's really what it's about. I mean, if you do well with individual students, you're going to have a good outcome as a whole for the school, and that's why I'm just concerned about this overemphasis on testing. Preparing a kid to take a test is not the same as preparing them to be successful in life. And while again I'll acknowledge you have to do some testing, that's not what it's about. It shouldn't be that is ultimately the thing. Right, the test is not the point of it. The child learning is the point, and you can't always measure that in the exact same way. And frankly, I'm not sure that we should, because there are so many different pathways that a child could take to being successful in life. And so most of us, we have strengths and we have weaknesses, and we build our lives around the things that we're good at, right? The things that we're interested in, the things that drive us. And I think about when I went to school, what got me up in the morning, why I went to school was music. It was music. I had a music class, and there was this one girl in one of my classes too. We've been married for 22 years now, but I mean, it was a thing that had me motivated. I was a better math student because I had choir class. I was a better science student because I had theater. I mean, that's what I was passionate about, and that's the part that I'm determined in my education white paper that I put out is that we have to get away from this one-size-fits-all approach where kids are exploring their passions, and the education is a whole different scenario when the child is passionate about something that's happening in their education day. When we find that, I think that's really where you have that internal motivation of a student, which is like the missing link when a student is really struggling. If they're struggling and they're going to school and there's no part of school that's interesting or exciting or where they feel like they're successful at, then the task of a teacher to get that student motivated to go out and learn and overcome those barriers, it becomes so much harder than if there's that thing that drives the student to be there and to want to be there.
Steve, you have a question about DPSCD.
Yes, Detroit Public Schools Community District, the largest district in the state, recently released a facilities report showing that it would cost $500 million to upgrade school facilities to bring them up to current standards. But because of past deals with the state, the district is not able to borrow money to pay for those renovations like any other district would. What is Lansing's role in upgrading these traditional public schools in the city of Detroit, or should the state allow the district to fundraise like other districts?
Well, I think that first of all, the work that the state did to relieve Detroit of a very significant amount of debt that accumulated over years has given them operational room to provide programming that is better than they ever could have done without the state help and assistance. When it comes to the debt management, I think that there is an openness to taking different approaches to facility upgrades in partnership with the state in terms of the way that they borrow money. It's going to be a little bit different. I mean, when the legislature made a very substantial appropriation to relieve debt, it's natural to expect that there's not just going to be wide open ability to just go out there and take out all that debt again. And so working with the professionals in our Treasury Department, I think there is room for that discussion. And I believe that signals have been sent, that the door is open for those discussions on how they might be able to borrow some money to upgrade facilities. Now, $500 million, I don't think that's that just going out for $500 million bond offering or something like that is particularly realistic given where the district is right now. But doing facility improvements to get them to the standards that are required for the education system, I believe that's doable. And as governor, I absolutely would work with the Detroit Public School District or Detroit Community Schools to make that happen.
Is it possible that the state could also set money aside specifically for school upgrades in Detroit Public Schools?
Well, I don't think that it's particularly likely that there's going to be some sort of specific set aside for one school district. To the extent that the state decides it needs to help in facilities like with hardening of schools, for example, and communication systems for schools and campus-wide monitoring and secure entryways and that sort of thing. Those types of appropriations are the sorts of things that are made, that when the state gets involved, that they're made available to everybody.
Hassan?
Should Michigan change laws regarding how charter schools are governed and funded?
No, I don't think that the ways that charter schools are either funded or established today is the problem. The key is that we need to have the same accountability standards across the board, no matter which public schools we're talking about. The thing about charter schools is that, I mean, they can only survive if parents believe that they're a better option than their other options that are available. And the idea of having parents in the driver's seat, I just think they're in a better position than anybody else to determine what is best for their kids. And so taking away options from parents is definitely not something I would favor.
What about funding? Should money allocated for public schools be used to fund charter schools?
charter schools are public schools, and I think they should be funded the same way as public schools, as traditional public schools. So charter public schools and traditional public schools, I think, should be funded with the same type of system.
Erin.
Should there be any changes at all to the way the charter schools are overseen and authorized?
Well, I think there's always room for improvement in the accountability for performance and results. I'll go back though to this expectation that our schools across the board should, whether they're traditional public schools or charter public schools, that we should hold them to the same standards.
Sandra?
I wanted to ask a little bit about higher education, the cost of it specifically for colleges and universities in Michigan. Is it too high? Is it prohibitive? What can the governor's office do about that, and what kind of policies would you have in office?
It is too high, and I think one of the problems, we're talking a macro level, and let's talk about some practical things. First of all, we have convinced a couple of generation of kids of the lie that there's only one definition of success. And so if you're a parent and your child doesn't go to a traditional university, then we've convinced people that they're somehow a failure as a parent, and the child is failing, or they take a consolation prize. I hear well-meaning people all the time say, well, not everybody's cut out for college, and those kids can go into the trades. The problem with that well-meaning statement is that it reinforces the false assertion that non-college post-high school education, because post-high school education is required, but non-college post-high school education somehow less. So what happens is you have this system that's like this service that is out there, and they have the market, right? So they're the definition of success. And if you are able to, in any other market, convince the entire public that if you don't buy what I'm selling, if you don't come and buy what I'm selling, your life is ruined. Parents, if your kids, or you don't buy this for your kids, you are a failure as a parent. If you had that market power, you could charge anything that you wanted, and people would line up to pay it. They would borrow money to pay it, and in fact, that's what's happening. And so the first thing I think we need to do is to show kids all the options that they could do with their life, and that's going to include competency-based education, certificate-based education, community colleges, universities, and apprenticeships, and across the board, so many different things. So the first thing is to add in competition to this equation, where all of the options are on the table, and universities are competing for kids instead of kids competing for universities. The other thing is, on a more practical level, middle college and dual enrollment is a real game changer. Now, when I went to the high school, I had the benefit of I was one of the schools that was an early adopter in that. By the time I started at college, I already had almost a year's worth of credits, and because of what I was able to get in high school, and through a local community college, and that was a huge advantage. And then I continued to go to community college while I was going to a university. It brought the cost way down overall. The middle college is even better. So you can spend 5 years in high school but graduate with an associate's degree and have half of a university degree already paid for without any cost at all to the student. Those are some practical changes, but we also have to expect that universities adopt the same sort of cost controls that the rest of government has over the last 7 or 8 years. I mean, that we have made cost control, taken cost control measures, local governments have, but largely universities haven't. And so as we have been trying to increase funding for universities, I think that we should do that in tandem with them taking cost control measures, so that you're doing both at the same time. You're bringing down the overall cost by additional state support, and also cost control, and students having all the options where they have the incentive to keep the cost down in the first place.
We talked a little bit of higher ed. Now let's look at some preschool options. Erin?
What can the state do about the high cost of childcare and the lack of preschool options for young children?
There's a really exciting thing happening right now that I'm so proud of, that is off the ground and launched now in Flint. There are two centers. One is Great Expectations, and the other one is Educare. And this was when I had moved my office to Flint in 2016. I worked with a lot of different groups of people on important things for the city to start moving forward in early childhood education, early executive development of the brain, proper nutrition, health care, all the things in developmental delay screening, all these things that were so important for kids 0 to 5. It seemed like there were programs, but they were in different silos, different locations, different intake criteria, and so it worked like a bunch of programs instead of a system. And so what I brought everybody together. So it was the school district and the ISD and Great Start and Head Start and the local congressman's office was there to help with some of the federal issues. I had people in the Department of Health and Human Services and different programs there as well. And we do we do daycare subsidies and Medicaid and food stamps and Great Start and Head Start, all these different things early on. All right, so how can we, instead of doing all these programs, could we blend these funding streams together and have full-time, year-round, high-quality, 0 to 5, daycare, childcare, early education, early literacy, developmental delay screening, interventions, helping the parents get back on their feet? Could we just do that together in one place instead of like in 10 different places? And there was a million reasons why it wouldn't work, but everybody worked together to make it happen. And we started with Cummings Elementary School, which is a closed elementary school, and the Mott Foundation made it like new, and it reopened as this new thing. And then the Mott Foundation built a brand new building, and the University of Michigan Flint is in there as well. They do the early childhood education, but they're also tracking the progress of the kids, and to see the difference it makes from them starting kindergarten ready to learn and how much better they'll do after that. All of those entities together, I mean, I'm just so excited about what this could mean. And on paper, it looks like it's expensive. But if you look, we do all those things anyway in other places and other ways and other parts of the budget. And by bringing them together, you're dealing with all of these different facets and problems at the same time. So when you have an area that has a lot of non-educational barriers to learning, then there are enough kids that qualify for enough things. You can just provide all those things on site full time year round, and so it's revolutionary for Michigan. I'm pumped about it. I think that if you read my education white paper, the early education part of it, it's based on the work that I and many others did and Educare in Flint.
Lieutenant Governor, before we leave the topic of education, I want to ask you something that you talked to Erin a little bit about, was about the governance structure of the Michigan Department of Education. Do you think that should change? Do you think the governor should be appointing the State Board of Education and then therefore appointing the superintendent? Would you change anything about the makeup of the MDE?
You know, it's a constitutional issue, and I think you can make a strong argument for making a change, but I'm not really interested in. I don't think that's really the problem. The governance and how people are elected and selected to go on the ballot and that sort of thing. When you bring a unifying approach and you have a new and a better mission for the Department of Education, I think that organization itself is going to do better. But to go off on try and get a constitutional amendment to try out another governance structure to see if it works any better than the current one, I just think that that's a whole lot of time and energy that ought to be spent on the mission of the Department of Education as opposed to the governance structure of it in the first place.
Okay. Before we turn to some more policy-specific questions, I want to ask about the workings in Lansing. Michigan's term limit will cause mass turnover in the year in the Senate, especially the House. How challenging do you think the loss of institutional knowledge will be? And as governor, how will you and your staff prepare to work with new lawmakers?
Well, first of all, I think that term limits oftentimes is used as kind of a scapegoat for anything that doesn't work well. I just point over to Washington, D.C. and there's no term limits there, and I see all kinds of gridlock over my entire lifetime. So I don't think it's necessarily term limits. When you have people that have an attitude about working together, whether they've been there for a long time or they've been there for a short period of time, good people do good things, and ineffective people are ineffective, no matter how long you give them to do it. So I don't think that term limits is really the problem. In fact, in my time, I've seen, I'd put the 2011-12 legislature up against any legislature in the history of Michigan and its effectiveness in an economic a situation of total economic crisis. and a brand new legislature, and they did amazing work. And it was like so many new people, new governor and new legislature, and it was like they didn't know they couldn't do all these things, and so they just did them. And look what happened: 540,000 new jobs, 17-year low on unemployment, 6th fastest income growth state in the nation since 2010. I mean, this is and we're #1 inbound migration of college graduates in the Great Lakes states now. After being last for a long time, we're #1 3 years in a row. I mean, that work was set up by a legislature that was elected under term limits. So that's why I look at it and say, philosophically, elections are kind of like term limits. But at the end of the day, I don't think that that's the problem. I think culturally we have to have an attitude about working together and understanding where other people are coming from. Relationships are important, but it doesn't really take that long to form relationships when you're intentional about that work. And that's how I've always approached things, and how I will continue to approach it in the future, is to be with people, right, when you're developing plans. I believe in getting coalitions of people together early in the process, and trying to develop plans. So whether it was autism insurance reform, or the criminal justice reform, or the opioid addiction epidemic, or the phase out of the industrial personal property tax. I mean, these initiatives that I led, you'll see that I just engaged with people early. I stayed engaged with a lot of people, and then did my best to bring people together to find a solution. And I think you can do it with or without term limits.
All right, let's tackle roads and infrastructure, and I'll turn that over to Riley with some questions.
So we all know that Michigan's roads are bad. A task force says the state needs $4 billion more just to maintain our infrastructure. How should Michigan pay to fix roads, bridges, and water systems?
One thing I want to point out, that commission's report, I hear the $4 billion number put out there a lot, but it's not suggesting that the state's portion of infrastructure is for it. It's kind of an all-encompassing number, including private sector infrastructure, that everything from gas lines to communications and so forth, airports, and including roads and bridges. But there's a couple of things here. First things first. The last two administrations took a borrow money approach, and so when Rick and I got to office, our transportation fund saw $2.3 billion, had $2.3 billion in debt. They spent all the borrowed money, and we were left just with $200+ million a year in loan payments. So we've been faithfully paying those payments down. We've paid off more than $1 billion now of that debt. We need to continue to pay off the rest of that, and that'll put $200 million, more than $200 million more every year into our roads. On top of that, though, we've been accelerating the phase-in of the $1.2 billion package that passed in 2015. This is really the first year that you see a substantial difference in the amount of construction that's happening, because it has been phased in. The next year, though, it'll be even bigger. Next year will be a record amount. And so as we're absorbing these additional resources into our roads, we're also doing things differently with integrated asset management and the way that the roads are engineered and the standards for the roads. So you have to have higher standards, and that really only counts or matters when you're rebuilding the road. Thankfully, now we're actually rebuilding roads. You can put patches on old junky roads, and it doesn't matter. The road is falling apart, the patches are going to fall apart. So it's rebuilding roads at higher standards. Putting more technology in the roads can help us to lower the overall cost of the work that has to be done. When we knew that we had a really bad congestion problem between Brighton and Ann Arbor, putting an additional lane on 23 both ways and replacing the road, because the whole road had to be replaced, it was going to cost like $400 million. Well, we didn't have $400 million. And so we challenged the engineers to come up with a better option. And so they were able to turn the shoulders into temporary lanes and put the sensors in the road, make it V2I technology in the roads that can open up a lane when congestion gets higher. So you don't want to always use a shoulder as a shoulder's there for a reason. You don't want to always use the shoulder as a lane, but for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night, we turned a $400 million project into a $100 million project. Still replace the whole road with higher standards than what the original road was built under. And then the final thing is integrated asset management. This is a simple concept, but it takes a lot of innovative management to make it happen. It's this expectation that everybody who shares a right-of-way has to coordinate their repair, maintenance, and replacement schedule. So you don't have a road that's paved and then they got to tear up a year later to put a new sewer line in or something, and then tear it up down here to do a culvert across the year after that, and for fiber, whatever. It's like the concept of if you had your driveway paved when they were paving the road by your house, it's a lot cheaper because the equipment and the materials, it's all right there, and that cost is shared. Well, we think that it could be very, very substantial savings by implementing that statewide. So at the end of the day, I still think it's going to be necessary for us to take, like we have been the last couple of revenue estimating conferences, to take additional money that's available from growth and put it into our roads. But ultimately, all of those things together are going to create a better future for our roads.
And I know on the campaign trail you've talked a little bit about Flint and your experience in Flint. As the recovery efforts continue there, what have you learned from the situation, and how would that inform what you do as governor?
A couple of things that I've talked to a lot of public officials about lessons learned, things that I really hope that everybody takes away from this. First of all, is when somebody says they have a problem, even if there's disagreement about that the default position should be to believe them. See, in Flint, it's like, well, we got this problem, and somebody says, well, but it's not really a problem, or you don't really understand, or everything is okay. But still, there's something, you got to stay at the table, keep talking, keep working toward it, keep validating, keep just getting to the bottom of what it is. And today, I think we have a trust problem, naturally, and so we have to keep working at that. But there's but in the beginning, like, people were right, and the experts were wrong. But then, so that's the first thing. People say they have a problem. Default on assuming that there is a problem. We got to get to the bottom of it, even if it's a different problem than what you think it might be on the front end. The second thing is, don't accept bureaucratic speak as answers to plain questions. It's a frustrating thing about looking backward, and as we sent all these emails out there, and I saw so many of the right questions being asked, but half answers being given that were more compliance speak as opposed to real answers. So as an example, if you were the mayor of a city and you asked your water department, is the water safe in the city? And the water department person comes back and says, according to our most recent set of samples, the Tier 1 sites have tested within the federal lead and copper rule. Now that kind of sounds like a yes, but it's not really a yes, right? Remember the question was, is the water okay? We can't allow for these technical compliance speak answers because there are so many different factors. In this case, is the federal rule or standard even right in the first place? Should that be our standard? What about the samples? Were the samples right? In Flint, it turned out that the samples that were being relied upon weren't as they were represented. And so how about the trend? Maybe it's still underneath the rule, but is the trend looking bad, or is it looking good, or looking stable? I mean, there's so many different additional pieces of information aside from a compliance statement. And that's where I really hope that everybody, every person in public office can take away from this, is that plain answers should be required when plain questions are asked.
So you touched on that, the federal rule standards. Would you push for changing that, at least at the state level? Is that something that you could do? Or?
Absolutely. In fact, I had led the Childhood Lead Poisoning Elimination Board, and even though I know that the name of the board is not necessarily that big of a deal, but it wasn't the lead reduction board, it's the lead poisoning elimination board. And that's huge, right? I mean, even in Flint, the majority of lead poisoning is not and never was from water. It's from lead in paint and dust and soil. And so there was this is a problem across the whole nation. And while it's a lot better than it was when all of us were growing up, it's still, any of it's bad. And so our goal should be eliminate this. So if we apply that to water infrastructure, the city of Lansing is a great example. They decided, without anybody requiring it, that this is a risk that we don't need to have in the ground, right? You can manage the risk, sure, with the right kind of water treatment, But why would you want to leave that risk anyway? So they had a systematic approach, neighborhood by neighborhood, where they just took out all the lead pipes. And over the course, it took them 12 years, but over the course of 12 years, they eliminated that risk from the ground. I think that is that's a reasonable approach. And so as we had moved forward on how do we all eliminate this risk in the future, that type of an attitude, like, yeah, we've got standards and the standards are a lot better than they used to be, but it's all bad, so let's just take an approach of getting rid of all of it.
Let's keep along the water quality question. Steve?
What would you do as governor to safeguard the Great Lakes?
Well, there's a lot of facets to that. First is invasive species, and we have to be aggressive on this. And what I like about the approach that we've taken so far is to bring all of our partners in with us. That's the thing about the Great Lakes, is that even though 4 out of 5 Great Lakes prefer Michigan, we do share borders with other states and provinces. So if we don't have everybody on board with what the practices are, then our greatest natural resource is at risk. So in cases like the Brandon Road locks, this is an area where it's been the Army Corps of Engineers has been frustratingly slow and not treated as urgent as what it ought to be. And there was a lot of the shippers and everything there in the other states that don't have as much at stake as us, I guess, were in the way of that. But then getting the Great Lakes governors and premiers together and reconvening that group, it was the basis for those relationships and the discussions on how do we best protect our Great Lakes. And we are finally seeing some progress there. We actually put in the budget this year some resources to support pushing that project, and we're getting more states and cities and provinces on board with what needs to happen. So invasive species is one really important area. Another is closing down decommissioning line 5, and that absolutely needs to happen. The main risk that was identified in the report was an anchor strike, and people wondered, well, I mean, who's going to drag an anchor through that area, or why would they? And then it happened, right? And thankfully, it was a strike and not a hook, and who knows what would have or could have happened. But what are the feasible alternatives? And you still have to move the fuel, and moving it by truck. That's worse, right? There are more risks involved with that as opposed to a pipeline. But we decided to go from there to studying the feasibility of different options. And you can actually tunnel a line far beneath, maybe 75 feet below the bed of the lake. And having a tunnel that you can walk through and do visual inspections on the outside and the inside of the pipe at the same time, I think is a very logical approach. And so that's what I'd like to see happen in the future, and what I absolutely will push for as governor.
Hassan?
How do you intend to combat water contamination caused by industrial chemical spills like PFAS?
Well, first of all, having standards in the first place is really important. So and we were surprised to learn that there really wasn't a federal standard on PFAS. There were suggestions. And so by rule, we established a standard so that we would have something to even enforce in the first place. But PFAS is a good example of an issue where the main contaminants or problems are things that happened in the past, and they're being recognized or realized now. And so we have to be very aggressive. But we're developing the science. We're part of developing the science around this in the first place. Surprisingly little has been done around the country, even though this is a problem all over the country. And everything from military bases to like Scotch Guard operations that use that type of material. And that's so standing up testing facilities and identifying what the extent of the problem is the chief or the first step. And then in terms of how to fix it going forward, really there are only 3 states that are actively engaged or working on this, including Michigan. But I expect that this is going to be a big national issue. This will be something that other states wake up to, and it is my hope that working together we can find a better path forward.
We have a little less than 20 minutes left, and we have a couple more topics to get to, including immigration, taxes, tax incentives, transparency, and a couple of other things here. So we'll move along to immigration. Hassan, you have a couple questions there.
Yeah, Governor Snyder established the Michigan Office for New Americans in 2014 and declared June as Immigrant Heritage Month this year. What steps would you take to attract more people to come to Michigan, given that we might lose a congressional seat because of population decline?
Yeah, you know, attraction of talent in from around the country, around the world is it's been just part of what has made America, or both America, but especially Michigan, so successful in the past. And the diversity of our state, as I've been on the campaign trail running for governor, I've gone out of my way to reach out to communities that that a lot of times Republicans don't show up at. And what I found, there are a ton of shared values in entrepreneurship and innovation and hard work and the importance of family. And I mean, there's just so much that unites us. But attraction of talent and being a welcoming place is really important. And we have to work hard. I think would be very intentional about separating out a debate around illegal immigration and legal immigration. Legal immigration is such an important cornerstone of Michigan, and it's something that I think that across the political spectrum you can get people to really rally around. And the thing is, you know, recruitment of people from around the world. I mean, heck, we can do it without even leaving Michigan because we have these world-class universities that attract in talent from all over the world. So I think that we have all the tools. The Office of New Americans was established to as a way to help to attract that talent. You know, ultimately though, we do need federal immigration reform. It's something that there's only so much progress you can make at the state level on these issues, and and we hear about it from industry and workforce shortages all across our state and practically every industry, where they're saying we just can't find enough people to fill all these jobs. And in fact, I think on mytalent.org we have about 110,000 open jobs right now, and so workforce development, training, connecting people who are left out to those jobs. You know, it's a great opportunity to leverage the job growth to help people, but it's also a great opportunity to attract people in. But I want to point out that that has started. I mean, the population decline, it's stabilized, and now we're growing. But on the inbound migration of college graduates, the net inbound migration into Michigan, we used to be 51st behind 49 states and the District of Columbia. Now we're 12th in America. We're number one in the Midwest 3 years in a row. And it's Chicago and Illinois, where we lost a whole generation of kids to. They're last now. They're literally 51st, and there's an inverse relationship there. I mean, we're getting our kids back from Chicago.
Do you think refugees should be a part of this plan?
Oh, people that are seeking help from religious persecution, I think that this is a really important aspect of America and what we have represented in the past. And so I do think that we have to be careful, of course, in the process, but that is something that we need to remain open to. I want to point out though that we also, you know, the way that immigration happens today, you know, I'm afraid that we set other countries though up for failure. That as we kind of take the best and the brightest people from other areas, the ones who would really, you know, physicians and civil engineers and you know, people that you really need to have a healthy, thriving community, when they're removed from another place, then the ability of that place to be a thriving, functional, growing place is diminished. And so that's why I just think we need to, again, I'm not running for Congress or United States Senate or President of the United States or anything of that nature, but in this entire debate, I think that we need to really focus when there's a lot of people that want to come here because there's something bad happening in the world, to the extent that we can make that something bad, fix the something bad so that they don't have to leave. I mean, who wants to leave home? I mean, that's the part of this equation that I think needs to be in that conversation.
Well, some people are forced to flee, but I did want to ask you if you would support the EB-5 visa program.
Yeah, well, again, that's a federal issue. So
Yep.
you know, supporting it or not supporting it is just an opinion as opposed to a policy. But the EB-5 program has been used in this state to create entrepreneurship and job growth opportunities in the past. The key is we have, of course, and I feel like we always have to qualify this. You have to be careful, right? In everything that we do, we have to be careful because the world has become a very dangerous place. And as long as we have the proper processes in place for how people enter into this country and our assurance that people have the best interests in mind, then I think that it's a great opportunity for growth and making our community stronger.
All right, let's go ahead and take a look at some taxes, tax incentives. Riley, I'm going to bring it over to you.
Do you believe that economic development deals with tax credits, incentives, etc. are necessary and useful for Michigan's communities?
In some cases they are, but they can't be your go-to strategy. So you can't make up for a bad environment by offering a tax incentive. Right? In the previous decade, when we had a tax code that was uncompetitive and labor laws that were that scared people away, and in a regulatory environment that was very unpredictable. So the idea was, hey, I know all of these things make it really hard to operate here, but if we pay you, will you come? That was kind of the way that economic development was done before. It doesn't work. We did as much or more economic development incentives as anybody else in the country, yet our economic performance was worse. So our approach has been, and what we need to continuously do, is to be competitive for everybody. So you have to have a good environment across the board to attract in new investment and growth among your current businesses, and for startups to be successful in your state. So that's the baseline. Now, once you've accomplished that, the idea of doing incentives for game changer deals that create more opportunity for everybody, then the bar needs to be very, very high, and the structure of those needs to be such that the state can't lose. In other words, you pay after the fact, after something happens, as opposed to anticipation of something happening. That if you follow those guidelines, then it is appropriate. I mean, there are some kind. For example, there'll be a building, the tallest building between Chicago and New York, will be in Detroit. I mean, that's pretty cool, and that's a game changer type of a move for a city, and quite a statement to make to the rest of the nation. It'll create all kinds of opportunity and demand. That's the sort of thing where there are some projects that create so much residual benefit that, yeah, maybe it does require or deserve to have an incentive, but incentives should be looked at like appropriations. It should meet that requirement.
Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
The economy's going well now, but it's likely in the next 4 years we'll have another recession hit. Do you have any specific budget priorities that you have to help Michigan weather that storm that we expect is coming?
Well, first of all, I would never go into a period of time with like a defeated attitude, like it's inevitable just because we've had so much growth in the past that we're bound to have a downturn. Our state has done a lot to prepare ourselves in terms of diversification, and in our overall economy, lowering the debt load, better budgeting processes, and also saving in the rainy day fund. I mean, all those things have set us up well. It's just good, solid management. When it comes to priorities, we have to be smart and provide value for dollars. The infrastructure has to be a priority. So it's like our roads and bridges, like the circulatory system of our economy, that has to remain a priority. And talent is really the new currency of economic development. People. I mean, that's how you attract in business and investment and growth, when you have the people that can do the work. So that's why I think that the people investment part of it, investing in our kids and lifelong learning and helping people make transitions and find new pathways when the world changes, it's essential. You can't let that slide.
All right, Erin.
Debbie and Ray in our audience want to know what your plans are for car insurance, specifically what you would do to lower rates.
Lower rates, and we absolutely do need to lower rates. The problems in the past have been that the advocates for auto no-fault insurance, they stack 6, 7, 8 major changes into one bill, and they try and muscle it through the process, but it always dies under its own weight. year after year after year, and nothing changes. I would take a much different approach. What I put on the table now, and what I think you could even get done yet this year, even in the middle of an election year, you could get this done. Start out with two major starting initiatives. First is a real fraud authority. Staff it up and give it teeth, and make it a deterrent, whether it's overutilization or inappropriate billing, the things that will make the biggest difference in the areas where the rates are the highest. And so I would start there, but then also apply transparency to the system. One of the problems that I see with this debate over auto no-fault insurance is that everybody brings their own facts to the table, and they don't match up. And so there's a lot of guesswork. If you were to subject the entire process, not just the MCCA, but the Catastrophic Claims Association, but the whole rate making process to total transparency, you can see the areas where the rates, what is driving the rates, both on the collision side and the healthcare side. So I don't think that you have to make a choice between good coverage and lower costs. I think that we can manage the costs better if we had the whole thing subjected to transparency. That will show us the areas of reforms that need to pass in order to lower the costs the most.
Sandra?
Interested in transit. How would your administration approach transit policy, both for Southeast Michigan, what's going on with the Regional Transit Authority, and also some of the rural areas of the state?
Well, this is, and let's talk about Southeast Michigan here first. I think the whole discussion needs a game changer. That asking the same old question over and over again, I don't think you're going to get a big difference in the outcome or the answer that the public gives. But we're in the middle now of this revolution in mobility, autonomous and connected vehicles, but also just everything about transportation, how vehicles and infrastructure work and are owned and operated. And so what I would love to see happen now is to insert a first in the world advancement in taking this technology that's being developed and deploy it to solve transit problems in our state. Give people a reason to be excited about it. Something bigger than a fixed line transit system where you have, okay, if you need to go on this route and you can meet up with our schedule, here's your option. I just don't think that people in Michigan, they haven't been willing to pay for that in the past. I don't think they're going to be as willing to pay for it in the future. But if you were to combine that with a real mobility solution that advanced the technology that we are driving here in Michigan, I just think people would be really excited about that, and we could further solidify being the international leader of the future of mobility.
All right, 2 more questions left here. Riley, go ahead.
What's your stance on the ballot initiative to change the way that we draw district lines? If you oppose the Voters Not Politicians initiative, what solution would you suggest to address what some people say is gerrymandering?
I definitely oppose that. I don't want to sound totally dismissive of the effort, because I appreciate the concerns, but everybody has politics, right? No matter who's drawing the lines, everybody has politics. And so the idea of we're going to have these people's politics at play as opposed to those people's politics at play, somebody who has to face voters, I just think that's a better option in terms of drawing the lines. But there are rules in place in Michigan that are very objective, right? That have been respected ever since the Supreme Court, around the time I was born, actually put into place. And that is that you have to break as few county lines as possible, right? And then, and to the extent to keep populations the same, and you got to break some county lines, you break as few township and municipal lines as possible. And to the extent that you have a bigger place like the city of Detroit, where you're going to have districts inside one city, break as few precinct lines as possible. So there is an objective standard. I don't really know how you come up with a standard more objective than that one. And so if you were to come up with a map that broke jurisdictional lines less than what was passed, I think you could take it to court and beat it. So that's there's an objective, logical standard in place. Now, I get it, the idea that people say, well, some of these districts are lopsided. People do tend to live in communities that that have the same types of political positions as them. In Michigan, we see that. There are some areas where if you wanted to make Detroit a 50-50 district, you'd have to gerrymander it. But if you don't gerrymander it and follow the rules, the non-gerrymandering rules that we have in place today, then they're going to be lopsided districts. Because within the city of Detroit, it's 90+% of people vote for Democrats. And so, and then there's other parts in our state where you have 75 to 80% of people vote for Republicans inside certain counties. And so when you take those things into consideration, I just think that that the whole approach, I think it's well intentioned, but I think it makes it less objective than the system that we have today.
Okay, quickly, we're going to try to get in two more quick things here. Sandra?
Michigan recently was rated lowest among all the states in the amount of transparency we have for state government. I'm interested if you think that's a problem and what you would do to address it, I guess specifically with the Freedom of Information Act and campaign finance disclosure.
It's a big problem. The changes, I mean, as a legislator, I actually introduced some of these reforms, and I actually put it in the book that I put out as well. It's just a free digital download book at futureofmichigan.com. The Freedom of Information Act subjecting the legislative and executive branches equally to it. So there was something that passed through the legislature recently that said the executive branch has a high standard, and there's just in name only for the legislature. That's not good enough. They need to be equal standards. Financial disclosure, absolutely. We could use the federal form for financial disclosure, come up with our own, either way. I do think that there should be a random audit process for that as well, where the financial disclosure can be checked for accuracy. And because conflicts of interest, that's what you're getting at there. And then income disclosure. We hear people talk about all the time tax returns. That's great. I put my tax returns out there the last 2 years, but but what are the sources of income? This is more important. You can't tell that from the tax return, right? You can't see where the income came from. And that's another important conflict of interest issue. So financial disclosure, absolutely yes, but it needs to be auditable, and it also needs to have the actual sources of income included or spelled out.
Steve, you want to end on a question with marijuana?
Michiganders vote on recreational marijuana this fall. What's your thoughts on that? And if it does pass, how will your administration implement it?
Well, I oppose it. I'll be voting against it. If it does pass, I will faithfully respect the will of the voters and implement it the best I can. We have other controlled substances and regulatory systems, so it's very doable to regulate it. My main concern is not one about where I think marijuana would be the worst thing ever. It's just that we already have a problem with filling all the jobs out there today, and I just think this is going to make it worse. And people don't maybe realize that just because something is legal doesn't mean that you can use it and still qualify for the job. And there are a lot of jobs that people, if they become users, will take themselves out of commission for. So I just, having another mind-altering substance out there, kind of with the endorsement of the state or the government on it, I think is a bad thing. If it passes, though, like tobacco or alcohol and those sorts of things, we'll have to come up with a regulatory system in order to make sure that we keep it as far away from kids as we can.
Okay, 6 quick fun questions, because I know all of this has been fun, but now we're going to end with some fun questions real quick. Erin.
What is the make and model of all of the cars currently in your household?
2012 Ford Fusion and a 2010 Buick Enclave, and then we're actually renting a Ford Expedition for a couple months, but those are the 2 family cars. And by the way, my Ford Fusion has 300,000 miles on it. Ford ought to put that in a commercial or something.
Wow. Sandra.
What is your favorite Michigan food, and who is your favorite Michigan author?
Well, I don't, I don't have an answer for you on a favorite Michigan author. I guess I've never looked at authors and where they're from, in books I read. But when it comes to favorite Michigan food, I would say, I'm kind of old-fashioned in that, the simpler the food, the better, and it's just home-style macaroni and cheese. Not out of the box, but where they mix all kinds of cheese, kind of crunchy on the top. I could eat that all day long.
With Michigan-made cheese.
And then, well, I mean,
Thank
naturally
you.
we have the best cows.
There you go. Hassan.
Just going back to the race for a second, can you recall any interesting or touching moment along the campaign trail when talking to voters?
Yeah, actually there was a lady who, she tapped on my shoulder, sitting right in front of her, and she asked, kind of shyly, she said, "Excuse me, are you the lieutenant governor?" And I said, "Yeah." You never know how that's going to go, But I said, "Yeah," and she said, "I have a son with autism, and we were lost. We couldn't get any help for him, and everything changed. He has ABA therapy, and he's doing so great now. I went from not speaking to speaking, and I know that was only possible from the work that you did. I could live off an interaction like that for a month. I had put up with all kinds of $1 million in negative ads against me. An interaction like that makes it all worth it."
Riley.
What are you reading right now? What book is on your nightstand?
Actually, my daughter and I are reading together a devotional book, and it goes through chapter by chapter in the Bible. I actually started just for it to be with me, but then we decided to do that together. So, but I mean, there are a lot of my reading these days. It's work reading, required reading for work, not necessarily leisure, but a lot of really interesting things out there, including reports from Bridge Magazine.
Steve.
When you're not campaigning, what makes for a good weekend? What do you enjoy doing?
I'd have to think really far back in my history for that one. No, I love running. On my 40th birthday, I had this thing where I said, I don't want anybody to do anything. And then the day before my birthday, it was clear that nobody was doing anything. And I thought, man, I'm turning 40, nobody's doing anything. And so I signed up on Friday. That was on a Friday. My birthday was on Saturday. And I signed up for the Ann Arbor Marathon on Sunday. And I didn't know how that was going to go because obviously I didn't do a lot of preparation for it. And so I wasn't worried about timing or anything. And I just settled into a 10-minute a mile pace. And I just ran 26.2 miles. And Ann Arbor's way hillier than I thought it was, but it was. I love running. I just absolutely love running, and I love playing piano. Those are my two kind of go-to things when it's just clear my mind or a stressful day. Love doing that.
And what was your first job?
Well, I worked for my dad in his office. Filing papers was my first job, but my first job outside of that was a janitor at a nursing home. And that was a tough job, but it was. I definitely learned how to work hard back then.
Well, we appreciate all of your time, and that is going to conclude our conversation with Republican candidate for governor, Lieutenant Governor Brian Calley. Many thanks to the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for its support. On behalf of the Detroit Journalism Cooperative, I'm Christy McDonald. Take care.
Thank you.